In the winter of 1916, a train pulled out of a Romanian station, carrying something almost beyond price, the gold reserve of an entire nation. About 93 tons of it would make this journey. Bullion, coins, the savings of a country at war, sent east for safekeeping, to be guarded by an ally inside the walls of the Moscow Kremlin.
Welcome to the Black File. I'm the voice behind the file, and tonight we open one that has never truly closed. This is the story of Tezaurul Romaniei, the Romanian treasure. Gold, crown jewels, paintings, and archives, handed to Russia for protection during the First World War, and then swallowed by a revolution. Some of it would come home, slowly, across the decades. The gold never did. More than a century later, the file is still open.
To understand the gold, you have to understand the danger it was fleeing. In August 1916, Romania entered the First World War on the side of the Allies. The gamble went badly. Within months, the Central Powers, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Bulgarian forces, drove deep into the country. By December 1916, they had taken Bucharest and most of the south.
The Romanian state did not fall, but it was forced to run. The government, the royal court of King Ferdinand I and Queen Marie, and the National Bank of Romania all retreated northeast to Iași in Moldova, a crowded, freezing, makeshift capital, packed into the last corner of the country, still in Romanian hands.
And there, in that corner, sat the nation's gold, the reserve of the National Bank, suddenly within reach of an advancing enemy.
So the leaders in Iași faced a brutal question. If the enemy kept advancing, the gold could be captured, and a captured treasury can finance the very army that took it. They needed somewhere safe. They turned to their great ally in the east, Russia. The decision was made to ship the treasure to Russia for safekeeping, to be guarded in Moscow, deep inside the Kremlin.
On paper, it was the prudent choice. Russia was a fellow member of the alliance, an empire vast enough to swallow any threat, and its capital lay far beyond the reach of German guns. The gold would simply wait out the war in a friendly vault and come home when the danger passed. That was the promise. Trust your fortune to a friend, and you will get it back.
History would test that promise to destruction.
The first transport left Iași by train on the 12th of December 1916 under armed guard. It carried the National Bank of Romania's own gold reserve. By the records of the time, an estimated 1,738 crates, holding gold valued then at around 314.5 million gold lei.
This was the first installment of a total that would reach roughly 93.4 tons of gold sent to Russia.
Picture the scene. In the depth of a war winter, in a refugee capital crammed against its own borders, men carefully loaded the wealth of a nation, crate by crate, onto railway wagons bound for Moscow. When the train reached its destination, the gold was deposited in the Kremlin armory, sealed inside the heart of Russian power, exactly as the agreement promised.
The first part of the bargain had been kept.
The first transport had been gold,
The second would be almost everything else. In late July of 1917, by the records, on the 27th, a second, far larger shipment set out for Moscow. In total value, it dwarfed the first. It carried more of the National Bank's assets, yes, but also a staggering inventory of a nation's most precious things, jewels, including the jewelry of Queen Marie herself, securities and financial instruments, the archives of the state, the deposits of countless institutions and private citizens, paintings and cultural treasures, even sacred relics.
The total declared value of this second shipment was estimated at over 7.5 billion gold lei. Most of it not gold at all, but the irreplaceable heritage and savings of a whole people. And like the gold before it, every crate of it was placed into Russian custody in Moscow. A nation had now entrusted not just its money, but its memory to an ally's vault.
Everything now rested on one fragile assumption, that the Russia which had promised to guard the treasure would still exist to give it back. It would not. In the autumn of 1917, in October and November, the Bolshevik Revolution swept away the old Russian order.
The empire that had taken the gold into the Kremlin was gone, and in its place rose a new regime with new enemies and new rules. The vault was the same. The hand on the key had changed completely.
For Romania, this was the worst possible turn. The treasure had been entrusted to a state, and that state had just ceased to exist. There was no longer an ally on the other end of the bargain, only a revolutionary government that owed Romania nothing and recognized none of the old promises. The safekeeping had become something else entirely.
The break came quickly, and it came as a decree. In January 1918, amid a bitter dispute over Bessarabia, Lenin's government broke off diplomatic relations with Romania. And it went further. It announced that it would not hand the treasure back, declaring in effect that the gold and valuables would not be returned to what it called the Romanian oligarchy.
With those words, the safekeeping ended and the seizure began.
The treasure was no longer being guarded for a friend. It was being held against an enemy. Consider what that meant for the people back home. The deposits of ordinary families, the archives of the state, the jewels of the Queen, the gold of the National Bank, all of it now sat in Moscow behind a door that a foreign revolution had decided to lock. The promise of a friendly vault had become, in a single political stroke, a one-way door.
And so began the long waiting. The war ended. Empires were redrawn. Romania emerged from the conflict enlarged and victorious, but its treasure stayed locked in Moscow, on the wrong side of a closed border and a hostile ideology. Years passed, then decades. Governments changed in both countries. The men who had loaded those crates grew old. Some died without ever seeing the gold come home.
For Romania, the treasure became a permanent ache in the national story. A fortune that everyone knew the exact size of, down to the crate, and that no one could touch. It was not lost. Its location was no secret. It simply could not be reached. A country had a vault key it was no longer allowed to use, and on the far side of that door sat the wealth and the memory of a nation, waiting for a thaw that refused to come. Then, at last, the door opened, just a crack. In 1935, during a thaw in relations between the two countries, the Soviet Union returned a portion of what it held. This was not the gold. What came back was chiefly archives, along with some cultural and artistic objects, and a set of relics, a number of crates, a gesture of goodwill, rather than a settling of accounts.
For Romania, it was something, and it was also a kind of message. Of everything in that Moscow vault, the part Russia was willing to release first was the part with the least raw value. The paper, the history, the holy objects. The gold, the heavy, fungible, spendable gold, stayed exactly where it was. A nation that had sent away a fortune was handed back a fraction and told, in effect, to be grateful for it.
The largest return came 21 years later, in 1956. This time it was a flood of culture rather than a trickle. Tens of thousands of objects came back to Romania. Paintings, manuscripts, coins, as Cloșca cu pui de aur, the hen with the golden chicks.
For the country's museums and its sense of itself, this mattered enormously. Priceless art and heritage that had been gone for almost 40 years was suddenly home again, where people could see it. And yet, read carefully, the 1956 return tells the same quiet story as 1935, only louder. What came back was culture, things you put behind glass and admire. The one thing that did not come back was the thing that had started it all, the gold reserve of the National Bank. Let us be precise about what was never given back. The roughly 93.4 tons of gold, the original reserve of the National Bank of Romania, the very thing the whole arrangement had been built to protect, was never returned. Not in 1935, not in 1956, not since.
Across more than 100 years and every twist of politics between the two countries, the gold has stayed in Russian hands.
Everything else in this story orbits that single, hard fact. The jewels, the archives, the paintings, the relics, the partial returns, the goodwill gestures, all of it is the frame around an empty center. The center is the gold, and the center never came home. A country sent its reserve abroad for a few years of safekeeping, and a century later, it is still waiting at the door. This was never allowed to fade into a footnote. For over a century, the treasure has remained a live grievance between Romania and Russia, raised again and again by Romanian parliaments and officials, never quietly forgotten. In the 2000s,
The two sides even formed a joint commission of Romanian and Russian historians to examine the question, to sit down and study the documents together. But study is not the same as restitution. The commission could examine the past. It could not unlock the vault. Russia has not returned the gold, and on the central point, the two countries simply do not agree.
The dossier has been opened, debated, footnoted, and filed, and then left exactly where it was, with the essential question still unanswered. Where is the gold, and when does Romania get it back?
So what is it actually worth, this thing that never came back? The honest answer is that the modern value of the gold runs into the billions, and that the figure almost misses the point. Yes, 93 tons of gold today would be a staggering sum, enough to reshape a national budget. But for Romania, the wound was never only financial.
It was the betrayal folded inside the word safekeeping.
A country cornered in war did the responsible thing. It protected its wealth by trusting an ally, and that trust was answered by a revolution that turned the favor into a seizure and the promise into a refusal. The lesson sits there, cold and permanent. The most dangerous place for a treasure is not in the path of an enemy. It is inside the vault of a friend whose government is about to change.
And so we come back to where we began. A train, a winter, a nation's gold rolling east towards Moscow under the promise of a safe return. 2 shipments, the National Bank's gold in December 1916, and then the jewels, the art, the archives, and Queen Marie's own jewelry in 1917. A revolution that turned safekeeping into seizure.
Decades of waiting, then 2 partial returns. The archives in 1935, and in 1956, the art and the Pietroasa treasure, the Kloshka Kupui de Aur. Heritage came home. The gold did not. Roughly 93 tons of it, still unreturned more than a century on.
This is not a mystery of where. Everyone knows where. It is a question of when and whether, and the answer has outlived everyone who first asked it. Tezaurul Romani remains exactly what it has always been, a national wound and a file that will not close. The dossier stays open. For now. Take care of yourselves, my friends, and I'll see you at the next case.